David had always been a man of routine. His life was simple, predictable, and calm. He lived alone in a small apartment, spending most of his time working at a desk job, reading books, and watching documentaries. He didn't mind the quiet life, but sometimes, late at night, he would find himself wishing for something more, something exciting, something different. One evening, while scrolling through an online auction site, something caught his eye. It wasn't the usual furniture or antiques that he typically browsed. No, this was different. The headline read, "A unique opportunity. A wild Amazonian woman for sale." David's curiosity was piqued. The listing didn't give much detail, just a few pictures and a short description. The woman in the images looked strong and independent. She had dark, wild hair and piercing eyes that seemed to stare right through the camera. The auction claimed that she came from an isolated tribe deep in the Amazon rainforest, far from civilization. The ad said she had been raised to survive in the wilderness, living a life free from modern society. David found himself unable to look away from the screen. There was something about her that made him feel both intrigued and uneasy. Was this real? He had heard rumors of strange auctions, but he never thought he would actually come across one. Despite the oddity of it all, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had to know more. As he read further, he learned that she was not just being sold as a servant or a slave. At least, that's not what the listing said. The woman was apparently being offered as part of a cultural exchange. The auction claimed that she had agreed to leave her home and experience the world outside her tribe, and her journey would be sponsored by whoever bid on her. The goal, as described, was for her to learn about modern life and for the buyer to learn about her unique primitive way of living. David shook his head in disbelief. The more he read, the more his mind raced. Who would buy someone like this? What kind of life did she really lead? What kind of person would agree to this kind of arrangement? But even as doubt settled in his mind, there was a voice inside him whispering, "Why not? What if this is the adventure you've been waiting for?" Before he knew it, his hand was reaching for his wallet. His fingers hovered over the Bid Now button. He hesitated, staring at the screen, unsure of what to do. Was it too crazy? What was he thinking? But there was something undeniable about the pull of the unknown. After a few more seconds of hesitation, David clicked the button. The screen flashed with a message. "Congratulations, you are now the winning bidder." David sat back in his chair, his heart racing. What had he just done? He had no idea what was coming next, but he felt both nervous and excited, as if his life was about to change in a way he couldn't yet understand. The next day, David received a message with the details for his meeting with her. The location was a private landing strip in the middle of nowhere, miles away from the city. He was instructed to arrive at noon, and a guide would take him to the woman. David spent the next few hours gathering his thoughts. What had he just gotten himself into? He couldn't stop thinking about the woman from the pictures. Would she really be like that? Wild and free, so different from the life he knew. He wasn't sure what to expect, but something deep inside told him that this would be unlike anything he had ever experienced before. He gathered his things, locked up his apartment, and set off toward the unknown. When David arrived at the landing strip, it was empty except for a small plane and a few crates. He felt a sense of unease creeping up his spine as he watched the plane taxi onto the runway. As it came to a stop, a tall figure emerged from the plane, her silhouette casting a long shadow in the afternoon sun. David's breath caught in his throat as he saw her for the first time. She was everything the auction had promised, and more. She was taller than he expected, her long dark hair flowing in the breeze, and her skin was tanned from years under the sun. She looked like someone who had never known what it was like to sit in an office or sleep in a comfortable bed. She was a force of nature, standing there with an almost defiant look on her face, as if she were unbothered by the world around her. The guide, who had accompanied David, greeted her, speaking to her in a language that sounded strange to David's ears. She didn't smile, nor did she show much emotion. She simply nodded and looked at David with those intense eyes, sizing him up. David took a deep breath and stepped forward, unsure of what to say. "Hello," he said, his voice sounding strange in the vast emptiness around them. "I'm David. I'm your new buyer." The woman didn't respond right away. Instead, she raised an eyebrow and studied him. There was a long, tense moment of silence before she spoke, her voice low and measured. "You are the one who bought me?" she asked, her tone surprisingly calm. David nodded, feeling a wave of uncertainty wash over him. "Yes, I didn't know what I was getting into. But I thought this could be the start of something interesting." The woman didn't say anything more. Instead, she turned to the guide, who spoke to her briefly before motioning to David. "She's ready to go with you," the guide said, a slight chuckle in his voice, as if he were watching something unfold that he found amusing. David nodded again, feeling a strange mix of emotions. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but the woman in front of him was unlike anyone he had ever met. There was no doubt about it. His life was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly predict. With a deep breath, David led the woman toward the vehicle waiting for them. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: it was going to be anything but ordinary. David had no idea what to expect as they traveled through the dense forest in the vehicle. The woman, Kara, sat quietly beside him, her eyes scanning the surroundings with sharp focus. She seemed completely at ease in the wilderness, as if the modern world had no meaning to her. The air inside the vehicle felt heavy with silence, and David couldn't help but feel a little out of place. He stole a glance at her, trying to make sense of what was happening. She was a striking figure, tall and strong, with muscles that hinted at a life of physical labor and survival. Her face was framed by long, dark hair that fell in wild waves, and her eyes seemed to hold a depth that David couldn't quite understand. He had read about her background in the auction listing, but it was one thing to read about it, and another to be in the presence of someone who had actually lived that life. David cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "So, do you want to talk about where you're from? What life was like before all of this?" he asked hesitantly. Kara's gaze shifted toward him, her eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing his question. She didn't answer immediately, and David wasn't sure if she hadn't understood or if she simply didn't feel like responding. He found himself awkwardly fiddling with his hands, unsure of how to navigate this strange situation. After a long pause, Kara finally spoke, her voice low and steady. "My people are from the deep jungle. We live by the land, not by rules or machines." She didn't elaborate further, and David realized that her words were loaded with meaning he couldn't quite grasp. He nodded, trying to show that he was listening, but 1,000 questions filled his mind. He had thought that bringing her to his home would be an exciting adventure, but he had underestimated how challenging it would be to understand someone who had lived a completely different life. "So, what do you think about all this?" David asked, motioning to the passing landscape, the cars and the roads. The city, the people, it must be a lot to take in. Kara's expression didn't change. She stared out the window, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, as though she was mapping the world in her mind. She hadn't yet shown much emotion, and David couldn't tell whether she was fascinated or simply indifferent to the changes around her. The road was long, and the silence between them grew thicker. David felt like an intruder in her world, unsure of how to connect with someone who had spent her life outside of civilization. He wanted to make her feel comfortable, but every time he tried to speak, it felt like he was only scratching the surface. When they finally reached his apartment, David noticed Kara's eyes widen ever so slightly as they pulled into the parking lot. The buildings were tall, the streets busy with people, and the noises of city life were everywhere. Kara, who had spent most of her life surrounded by nature's quiet, seemed to take in everything around her with a sense of curiosity. "This place," Kara murmured, more to herself than to David. She sounded almost surprised, as if she hadn't imagined a place like this could exist. David, feeling a bit nervous, stepped out of the car and opened the door for her. Kara didn't move right away, and David wondered if she was hesitating. After a moment, she stepped out and looked around, her gaze fixed on the city's skyline in the distance. She seemed to be studying every detail, every corner, every person walking by, every sound that filled the air. "What's wrong?" David asked, a little concerned. Kara turned her head slowly, meeting his eyes for the first time since their conversation started. "This place is not mine. It feels strange." David nodded, understanding her sentiment. I know. It's a lot to take in. But you'll get used to it. Maybe. I hope." She gave him a silent look, as if she was not entirely convinced. David knew that what she was feeling was far beyond his ability to understand. He was no expert in survival or living off the land. He had no idea how to help her adjust to the world he lived in. They walked to the apartment, and as they entered, Kara's eyes scanned every inch of the space. The walls were decorated with furniture and modern gadgets, things she had likely never seen before. The kitchen was full of appliances, and the living room had a large TV, which David thought was normal, but was surely an alien concept to her. Kara walked over to the window, gazing out at the city below. Her sharp eyes seemed to take in everything with intense focus. "This is not how I live," she said quietly. David didn't know how to respond to that. He had hoped that the comfort of the apartment would help her adjust, but it seemed to only make her feel more out of place. He felt a pang of guilt. He had bought her to live in this world, but was he making a mistake? Should he have tried to learn more about her life before making such a big decision? "Do you want me to leave?" David asked carefully. "I mean, if you're not comfortable here, I can take you back. I'll help you find a way to go back to the jungle if that's what you want." Kara turned back toward him, her face softening just a little. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for you." Her voice was calm, but there was a hint of sadness in her words. "But I'm here now. I'll stay for a while. Just don't expect me to change." David felt a wave of relief wash over him. At least she wasn't leaving right away. But he knew that this wasn't going to be easy. There was a long road ahead, filled with misunderstandings, cultural clashes, and moments of tension. But there was also something else, something he hadn't expected. A connection between them, however small, however fragile. "I'm not trying to change you, Kara," David said, his voice sincere. "I just want you to feel safe here, to have a place where you can be yourself." Kara didn't respond right away. She simply nodded and returned her gaze to the city outside the window. David knew they were both in uncharted territory, and the journey they were about to embark on would be nothing like anything either of them had ever known. As days turned into weeks, David quickly realized that living with Kara was going to be nothing like what he had imagined. The early excitement of having her around faded into the background as the challenges of their different worlds became more obvious. Every day, he saw more and more how little they had in common, and it was beginning to weigh on him. Kara was not like the women he had known. She had grown up in the wild, surrounded by trees and rivers, with nothing but the basics of survival to focus on. The modern world, with its phones, internet, and convenience, seemed strange and overwhelming to her. David tried to explain things, but it was clear that his words didn't carry the same weight as the lessons she had learned from the land. She spent most of her time avoiding the apartment's comforts. She wouldn't sit on the couch, preferring instead to pace around the room or stand by the window, staring out into the streets below. The noise of the city seemed to disturb her, and sometimes David could see the tension in her shoulders, like a coiled spring ready to snap. He began to notice that Kara didn't smile much, and when she did, it was often followed by a quiet sigh, as if she were lost in her own thoughts. David tried to make small talk, asking her how her day had gone or what she wanted to do, but her answers were short and distracted. She didn't seem to care about the things that interested him. Things like watching TV, reading, or going for a walk in the park. The only time she came alive was when he mentioned something related to nature. She would nod with a look of longing in her eyes, and David realized that talking about the world she had known was the only way to make a real connection. One afternoon, David came home to find the door to the apartment slightly ajar. His heart skipped a beat as he stepped inside, calling out, "Kara." There was no answer. He moved quickly through the apartment, his eyes scanning every room. He found her by the window, standing at the edge of the balcony, her body tense. She was looking out over the city, but her focus seemed to be far beyond the buildings, as though she was seeing something else entirely. "Kara," David said, taking a cautious step toward her. "What's going on? Are you okay?" She turned slowly, her face unreadable. "I need to leave," she said, her voice low but firm. "This place, it's not for me." David's chest tightened. He had feared this day would come. The thought of Kara leaving was something he couldn't bear. He had tried to help her adjust, to make her feel welcome, but now it seemed like everything had been a mistake. The city, the apartment, everything. It was too much for her. He knew she didn't belong here, but did that mean she had to leave? "Please, Kara," David said softly, trying to hide the panic rising in his voice. "You don't have to go. We can figure this out together. Just give it more time. I'll help you find a way to make this work." But Kara shook her head, her gaze distant. "You don't understand. I can't stay here. I can't live like this. I don't belong in your world." David's heart sank. He knew she was right. She didn't belong here. He didn't belong in her world either. But there had to be a middle ground. There had to be a way for them to both find happiness, even if it meant making huge sacrifices. "I know it's hard, Kara," David said, stepping closer. "But this is your home now. I want to help you adjust. We don't have to change who you are, but maybe we can find a way for you to feel comfortable here. This doesn't have to be a prison. We can learn from each other." Kara didn't respond right away. She stood there, looking out at the city below, her expression unreadable. David wasn't sure if she was listening or if his words had fallen on deaf ears. For a long time, the only sound was the hum of the city around them. David's mind raced as he wondered what he could say or do to change her mind. He had tried to give her space, to let her be herself, but now he realized that what she needed wasn't space, it was freedom. The freedom to leave, to go back to the world she knew. He took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. "If you really want to leave, Kara, I won't stop you," he said quietly. "But I'm asking you to stay for a little longer. We can go at your pace. If you want to go back to the jungle, I'll make that happen. But please, don't leave without giving it a fair chance." Kara didn't look at him, but David could see the conflict in her eyes. It was clear that she was torn. She didn't want to hurt him, but she also didn't want to live in a world that felt so foreign to her. "I'm not asking you to change who you are," David continued. "I just want you to know that I'm here for you. We can figure this out together." For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, Kara turned and faced him, her eyes searching his face as if weighing his words. "You don't understand," she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. "But I'm trying to. I don't know if I can stay, but I'll think about it." David nodded, his heart still heavy. He didn't know what the future held, but for now, he had to respect her decision. He couldn't force her to stay, but he could give her the space she needed to find her own way. The struggle for freedom wasn't just Kara's, it was his too. The realization that they were both prisoners of their circumstances was something David hadn't expected. But as he stood there, watching Kara look out over the city, he understood that sometimes the most difficult thing was giving someone the freedom to choose their own path. The days following their tense conversation were quiet. David tried to give Kara the space she needed, but the silence between them was thick with unspoken words. Kara spent more time alone, retreating into her own world, while David went about his daily routine, feeling more and more disconnected from the woman who had entered his life so unexpectedly. One evening, as David sat down for dinner, Kara joined him at the table. She didn't sit across from him as usual. Instead, she took a seat beside him, her posture stiff, but not as distant as it had been. She looked at him with an intensity that made his stomach tighten. "I think I owe you an explanation," Kara said, her voice low but steady. David put his fork down, giving her his full attention. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He had known there was more to her than the silent, guarded woman he had seen over the past few weeks. He wanted to know the truth. "I wasn't always like this," she continued, her gaze shifting to the floor. "I wasn't always alone." David didn't speak, letting her words hang in the air. Kara hesitated for a moment before she looked up at him, her eyes softening slightly. "I was born into a tribe, deep in the jungle, far from anything you know. My people live by the land, and we don't rely on the things you take for granted, your phones, your machines. We rely on each other. We live to survive. There I was part of something bigger than myself." David leaned forward, his curiosity growing. "What happened to your tribe?" Kara's face hardened, and for a brief moment, her expression was filled with pain. "They were destroyed," she said flatly, "by people like you." David flinched. He wasn't sure if she was speaking about the modern world in general, or if she meant something more specific, but there was no time to ask for clarification. Kara continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were a peaceful tribe. We didn't want to fight. But there were those who saw us as a threat. They came with guns, with soldiers. They wanted our land, our resources. They killed everyone." David's heart sank as he listened to her. He couldn't imagine the horror of what she had experienced. His world of quiet apartments and office work seemed so far removed from the violent world Kara had grown up in. "I was one of the few who survived," Kara said, her voice filled with a bitter edge. "I ran. I hid in the jungle for months alone. I couldn't go back. I couldn't face the memories of what had happened." David sat in silence, processing her words. He didn't know what to say. How could he? What could he possibly offer to ease the pain of losing everything? Kara's eyes met his once more, her gaze no longer guarded but raw with emotion. "I lived alone for a long time. I learned how to survive, how to live with nothing but the earth beneath my feet. But even then, I was still haunted by what happened. Every day, every night, I thought about my people, my family. They were gone, and I was the last one left." David could see the pain in her eyes, and a heavy silence settled between them. He didn't know what to say or how to comfort her. He could only listen. And in that moment, he realized how little he truly understood about the woman sitting beside him. Her life had been shaped by loss and survival, not by the comforts of civilization. She wasn't just someone he had brought into his world. She was a survivor, a warrior who had endured more than he could ever imagine. "I didn't ask to come here," Kara said, breaking the silence. "I didn't ask to be bought, to live in a world that's nothing like the one I knew. But I'm here now, and I'm trying to make sense of it." David nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't expect you to change. I don't want you to. I just want you to be safe. I want to help you, find a way to heal." Kara looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. "Healing is not so simple," she said softly. "I don't know if I'll ever heal. My past is always with me, even when I don't want it to be." David didn't know how to respond to that. He had lived a life of relative peace, untouched by the kind of violence and loss Kara had endured. But somehow he understood that healing wasn't something that could happen overnight, and it wasn't something that could be forced. For the next few days, their conversations became less about small talk and more about understanding. Kara shared more about her life, her tribe, and the horrors she had faced. David listened, trying to understand her pain, but there was a distance between them that he couldn't close. Her past was a part of her that he could never fully reach. Despite the growing connection between them, there was still something unspoken between them, a wall that neither of them knew how to break down. David wanted to help Kara, but he wasn't sure how. Her past, her memories were too heavy for him to carry. He could offer her a home, safety, but he couldn't erase what had been done to her. As Kara began to open up more, David realized that their paths had crossed for a reason. They were both searching for something: freedom, healing, or perhaps just a sense of peace. But finding that peace was going to be harder than either of them had imagined. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Kara stood up suddenly, her eyes darting toward the window. David followed her gaze, but all he saw was the fading light of the city as the sun set. "I need to go," Kara said quietly. "I need to go back. Not to the jungle, but somewhere. Somewhere I can be alone." David felt his heart drop. He knew this moment was coming. The space between them had grown too large for him to bridge, and Kara was once again seeking escape. He didn't want to lose her, but he also knew that sometimes the only way to help someone was to give them the freedom to make their own choices. "I understand," David said, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. "I'll help you, Kara. If you need to go, I won't stop you." Kara nodded, her face softening. For the first time in weeks, she looked at peace. She wasn't running away this time. She was making a choice. The decision to leave wasn't an easy one for Kara. She had made up her mind. But every time she looked at David, there was a part of her that hesitated. She had lived alone for so long, and now, for the first time in years, she was starting to feel a connection to someone again. But she didn't belong in this world, and David's world was a far cry from the jungle she had known all her life. That evening, after Kara had said she was leaving, David sat quietly in the living room, his mind racing. He had wanted to help her, to be the person who could offer her a safe place, but he was beginning to realize that there were limits to what he could do. Despite all his attempts to understand, to make her feel comfortable, the distance between them only seemed to grow. David knew that Kara needed to go. She needed to find herself again, somewhere far away from the chaos of the city. He understood that now, but he wasn't ready to let her go just yet, not without at least trying one more time to help. The next morning, David woke up early, his thoughts still on Kara. He knew she hadn't made a decision yet, but he could feel the weight of her inner struggle. She hadn't left, but the tension in the apartment was palpable. He needed to find a way to help her see that there was more to her life than the past she couldn't escape from. He thought about her words the night before. "I don't know if I'll ever heal. My past is always with me." Those words had stuck with him. Healing was not something that could be rushed or forced, but maybe, just maybe, he could help her in a different way. By offering her a new purpose, a way to fight back against the life that had been taken from her. David decided to speak to her, but this time, he wouldn't focus on her past. Instead, he would focus on the future, the things they could do together, the way they could fight for something worth living for. Later that morning, as Kara stood by the window, gazing out at the bustling streets below, David walked up to her, his voice calm but firm. "Kara, I get it. You want to leave. You want to go back to your world, your life. But before you make that decision, I want to ask you one thing. Have you ever thought about fighting for something new? Something that's yours and yours alone?" Kara turned to him, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" David hesitated, then said, "What if you didn't have to run anymore? What if you could fight for something, your freedom, your life, something that was worth protecting?" Kara raised an eyebrow, clearly confused. "Fight for what?" "Fight for a new life," David said, his voice steady. "You've been running for so long, trying to escape your past. But maybe the only way to really move forward is to stand and fight. You don't have to live in the shadow of what happened to your tribe. You can build something new." Kara's eyes narrowed, her gaze sharp. "I don't need a new life," she said, her tone hardening. "I just need to be left alone." David stepped closer, determined not to back down. I'm not asking you to change who you are. I'm asking you to think about your future, about what you want out of it. I can't offer you your past, Kara, but I can offer you a chance to fight for something better. Something worth living for. There was a long silence. Kara didn't say anything, but her eyes betrayed the conflict that was brewing within her. She was torn between the life she had known and the life David was offering her, one of choice, not survival. David saw the way she hesitated. He knew that she wasn't ready to give up on her past, but he also saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a glimmer of hope, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. I don't know how to fight for something like that, Kara admitted after a long pause. I only know how to survive. I don't know what it means to have a future. David nodded, understanding her frustration. I know, but you don't have to do it alone. We can figure it out together. We can start small. You don't have to leave right now, Kara. Just give it time. You might find that there's more to life than what you've known. Kara stood still for a moment, her eyes distant, as though she was considering his words. David held his breath, waiting. He knew that this wasn't a decision she could make overnight, but he had to at least try to plant the seed. I've lived in the jungle my whole life, she said softly, almost to herself. I don't know if I can fit into your world, David. I don't even know if I want to. David's heart sank. He had hoped that his words would give her a sense of purpose, something to hold on to, but he understood that healing wasn't that simple. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. You don't have to fit in, he said. You just have to be yourself. And if that means we fight for a future together, then I'll be here with you. Whatever it takes. Kara's eyes softened slightly, and for the first time in weeks, David saw a faint smile tug at the corner of her lips. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A small sign that maybe, just maybe, he was getting through to her. I don't know if I can trust you, Kara said quietly. But I'll try. I'll stay a little longer. I want to see if there's something worth fighting for here. David smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. He hadn't convinced her completely, but he had given her something to think about. A reason to stay, to try again. I promise, Kara, David said softly. I'll never ask you to change, but I'm not going to let you give up on yourself either. And just like that, the walls between them began to come down, brick by brick, as they moved toward an uncertain future together. One filled with challenges, yes, but also the possibility of something new. The next few days passed slowly, but there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere between David and Kara. Kara had decided to stay, and while she wasn't fully convinced that she belonged in David's world, she had agreed to give it a chance. It wasn't easy for either of them, but they were slowly learning to adjust to each other's presence. David began to see Kara in a new light, not just as a woman from a different world, but as a survivor, someone who had lived through unimaginable hardships. David's life, once filled with quiet routines, now had an unpredictable energy. Kara wasn't the easiest person to live with. She still avoided many of the comforts he had come to enjoy, but she was trying. She would sit with him during meals, though her gaze would often drift to the window, as if looking for something she couldn't find inside. She would go for walks outside, keeping to herself, but David noticed that she wasn't as distant as she had been before. She was beginning to open up in her own way. One evening, after a particularly quiet dinner, Kara stood up abruptly, her face serious. David, she said, her voice sharp and focused. We need to talk. David looked up from his plate, his fork still in his hand. He had learned that when Kara spoke like this, something important was coming. He set his fork down and gave her his full attention. What's going on? He asked. Kara's eyes were fixed on him. I can't stay in this apartment forever. I've been thinking about it. I know you want to help me, but I'm not just going to sit here and do nothing. David frowned. I never asked you to sit around. I just want you to feel safe. Kara shook her head, her voice growing stronger. It's not enough. I need to move. to do something. I can't just be a guest in your world. I don't know how to live like this. David understood. He had sensed that Kara's restlessness was more than just about being in a new place. It was about needing to feel alive again, to have a purpose. "What do you want to do?" David asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Kara hesitated for a moment, then spoke with determination. "I want to learn. I want to know how to fight for something. I want to understand what it means to be part of something, to stand up and protect what's mine." David's heart skipped a beat. "You want to fight?" Kara nodded, her expression fierce. "I've fought my whole life. But now, I want to learn how to fight for something that matters. I don't know what it means to protect a home, a future. I only know how to survive." David was silent for a moment, his thoughts racing. He had no experience with survival skills like Kara had, but he knew he had to help her find the outlet she was looking for. This wasn't just about showing her how to live in the city. It was about giving her the chance to reclaim control over her life. "You want to train?" David asked, the idea slowly forming in his mind. "I can help you. I can find a way for you to learn." Kara met his gaze with an intensity that made David's heart race. "I don't want to sit in a class or study books. I need to be out there. I need to feel the world again, to fight for something real." David nodded slowly, understanding what she meant. "All right, let's do it." For the next few days, David researched ways to help Kara gain the skills she was looking for. He found a nearby training facility, a place where people could learn self-defense and combat skills. It wasn't much, but it was something. He signed both of them up for classes. Kara, of course, was hesitant. She had never learned to fight with rules or structure, but she agreed to try. David could tell she was nervous, but there was also a fire in her eyes. The day of their first class arrived, and Kara was quiet as they entered the facility. The room was filled with people of all ages and backgrounds, some stretching, others warming up for the upcoming lesson. Kara scanned the room, her eyes sharp, her posture tense. David could feel her discomfort, but he gently nudged her, trying to offer a sense of calm. "You don't have to do this alone," David said softly. "I'll be right here with you." Kara didn't say anything in response, but the smallest of nods told David she appreciated his presence. They found a spot near the back of the room and waited for the instructor to begin. The class started with basic exercises, simple stretches, footwork, and positioning. David could see that Kara's focus was razor sharp, but she seemed out of place among the others. She wasn't used to these movements, these routines. She had always relied on instinct, not technique. But despite the discomfort, Kara threw herself into the exercises with determination. She was a fast learner, and soon enough, she was following the instructor's commands with precision. As the class progressed, Kara's confidence grew. The more she practiced, the more she seemed to regain control over her body. She wasn't just surviving now. She was learning, adapting, becoming something more. David watched her with a growing sense of admiration. This was the Kara he had hoped to see, the warrior who had survived the worst. But now, she was fighting for something greater than survival. After the class, Kara was tired but pleased with herself. She didn't smile, but David could see the satisfaction in her eyes. She had proven something to herself. She could still learn, still fight for something. That wasn't so bad, was it? David asked as they walked back to the car. Kara glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "It's different, but I think it's what I need." David smiled, relieved. He could see that Kara was beginning to find a way to be herself again. She wasn't completely healed, and the journey wasn't over, but it felt like they were heading in the right direction. As they drove home, David realized that this wasn't just about helping Kara adapt to a new life. It was about giving her the tools to shape her own future. And in the process, maybe he was learning a little bit about himself too. The weeks passed, and the bond between David and Kara grew stronger. Though their lives were still worlds apart, There was a sense of understanding that was beginning to take shape between them. Kara was no longer just a visitor in David's world. She was becoming a part of it, slowly but surely. The city was still foreign to her, and she was still adjusting. But the fire that had burned in her when she first arrived had transformed into a focused determination. She was no longer just surviving. She was living, learning, and growing. David noticed that Kara's attitude had shifted. She began to smile more often, even if the smile was small and fleeting. She would laugh softly at the jokes he made, and when they were out walking or running errands, she no longer kept her distance. She began to interact with people more, though she still preferred to keep to herself. But there was a change, and it was something David couldn't help but notice. One morning, after their usual run, Kara returned to the apartment, her breath still heavy from the workout. David was sitting at the table, sipping his coffee when she walked in. Her hair was wild and damp from the rain that had begun to fall, but her face was determined, her posture strong. "I think I'm ready," Kara said, her voice steady. "Ready to move on." David looked up at her, his heart beating a little faster. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He knew Kara had been struggling with the idea of moving on from her past, but now it seemed like she had finally found the strength to do it. "What do you mean?" David asked, his voice gentle but curious. "I mean I'm ready to leave the city," Kara said, her eyes meeting his. "Not because I don't want to be here with you, but because I need to find my own path. I need to know what it means to live for myself, without running from my past." David's heart sank for a moment, but he understood. He had known that this day would come. Kara had learned what she needed to in the city, but now it was time for her to move forward, on her own terms. He didn't want to hold her back, but part of him wasn't ready to let go. "If that's what you want," David said, his voice soft but filled with understanding. "I'll help you. I want you to be happy, Kara. I just want you to know that whatever happens, you're not alone." Kara smiled, her expression softening. "I know. And I appreciate everything you've done for me, David. You've given me more than I ever expected. But I have to do this for myself." David nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He had known all along that he couldn't keep Kara in his world forever. She was a force of nature, and she needed to find her own way, just as she had been doing since the day they met. Kara paused for a moment, as if unsure of how to continue. "I don't know where I'll go," she said, her voice quieter now. "But I think I'll head back to the wilderness, somewhere I can be at peace with myself. I'm not sure yet, but I need to find a place where I can start fresh, where I can be who I am without looking over my shoulder." David's heart ached at her words, but he understood. He had seen the inner struggle she had faced, the weight of her past that she had been trying to outrun. Now it seemed like she was finally ready to face it head-on, to confront the pain and make peace with it. "You know I'll always be here for you," David said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "You don't have to do this alone, but I also know that you need to take this step for yourself, so I'll respect your decision." Kara nodded, and for the first time, David saw a sense of peace in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. She wasn't running anymore. She was walking towards something new, and that made all the difference. That afternoon, Kara packed her things, just a few clothes, a few personal items, and quietly prepared to leave. David helped her with the final bits of packing, but there was no need for words. They both knew what this moment meant. It wasn't goodbye, but it was a turning point. Before Kara left, David gave her something. A small journal he had bought for her a few weeks earlier. It was simple, nothing fancy, but it was a place where she could write down her thoughts, her feelings, her experiences. "I thought you might need this," David said, handing her the journal. "A way to remember everything, good and bad. You might want to write down your story someday. And when you do, I'll be here to read it." Kara took the journal from him, her hands trembling slightly. She smiled faintly, then looked up at him with a mixture of gratitude and sadness in her eyes. "I don't know if I'll ever write it," she said softly. "But thank you. You've been a good friend David, I'll never forget what you've done for me. David smiled, though his heart was heavy. I'll never forget you, Kara. You've taught me more than I could ever explain. I'll always be here if you need me. With that, Kara turned and left the apartment, her footsteps echoing softly as she made her way out the door. David stood at the window, watching her disappear into the distance. He didn't know where her journey would take her, but he knew one thing for sure. Kara had found the strength to move forward. She was no longer a prisoner of her past, and she was no longer running from the future. As he stood there, watching the rain fall softly outside, David felt a deep sense of peace. Kara had gone, but her presence would always remain in his heart. He knew that, no matter where life took them, they would both continue to grow, to fight, and to live. And for now, that was enough.